Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a world so different from ours, it might just knock the breath out of you. The harsh, gritty, unforgiving life of medieval times. Imagine waking up in a cramped, smoky room with the faint smell of last week's cooking and yesterday's waste lingering just beneath the wooden floorboards. You trudge out onto cobblestone streets slick with mud and who knows what else. The air feels thick, heavy, and honestly, a little hostile. And before you get too comfy thinking you're a survivor, let me drop a reality check. You probably won't last this. Nope, not even a day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments so we can see who's joining this medieval nightmare live. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Right off the bat, the biggest shocker is just how wildly different your modern life is compared to medieval living. You, sitting there in your cozy chair with climate control, filtered water, and probably a smartphone within reach, are worlds apart from someone living in, say, 14th century Europe. Modern comfort is a bubble that insulates you from the raw brutality of the past. The medieval world didn't come with soft beds, endless snacks, or reliable toilets, more like hard straw mattresses, hunger pangs, and chamber pots. Your life today is filled with invisible helpers. Air conditioning keeps you cool. Refrigeration preserves your food. Medical science keeps you alive through illnesses that once killed millions. The medieval person? They faced biting cold and sweltering heat without relief, scavenged for food that could spoil within hours, and lived in fear of sickness that modern medicine now cures easily. Historians still argue whether the Dark Ages were truly dark or just misunderstood. But the struggles of daily survival? That's undeniable. And that's just the surface. Imagine the sensory overload. The noise of livestock mingling with human voices. The stench of open sewers. The thick smoke of wood fires burning day and night. Contrast that with your quiet, filtered environment, and you start to see why your modern senses would rebel instantly. Even before stepping outside, your routines would shatter. Forget about a quick shower or a clean set of clothes daily. Bathing was rare and often discouraged due to superstition and the risk of illness. Clothing was heavy, scratchy, and cleaned less often than your shoes. So you see, the chasm between then and now isn't just about technology or culture, it's about survival itself. The medieval world demands a toughness, resilience, and acceptance of discomfort that your modern self probably wasn't built for. This is why, when dropped unprepared into medieval times, most people wouldn't last a day. Stay with me, because as we move forward, you'll get a front row seat to the grim realities that would grind you down faster than you can say plague. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from another time? Well, brace yourself for the medieval equivalent of health and hygiene. It's a wild ride. You step outside and immediately the reality slaps you in the face. The streets are filthy beyond anything you've ever imagined. Forget about your neatly paved sidewalks or sanitized public spaces. Medieval towns are more like open cesspools masquerading as homes to hundreds or thousands. You trudge down uneven cobblestones slick with mud, animal dung, and rotting waste. The stench is so pungent, it wraps around your nose like a wet blanket, making each breath a calculated risk. Your modern lungs, used to filtered air, gasp for relief, but there is none. It wasn't just bad luck that made medieval streets so foul. They were built without sewage systems. Instead, human and animal waste was dumped directly into the streets or shallow pits. Chamber pots were emptied out the nearest window, often right onto passers-by below. Yes, you might get a surprise shower. In fact, in some cities, it was a crime punishable by fines to keep your waste indoors for too long because of the smell. But no one really had a better alternative. Historians still argue whether medieval towns were as universally filthy as popular lore suggests. But even the most optimistic accounts confirm a distinct lack of cleanliness by today's standards. The lack of sanitation meant diseases spread like wildfire. The infamous Black Death, which wiped out up to half of Europe's population in the 14th century, thrived in these conditions. Rats carrying infected fleas ran rampant in the filth, and people had no idea that tiny creatures invisible to the naked eye were killing millions. Instead, many blamed divine punishment or bad air, miasma, a theory that led to fumigations and carrying herbs to cleanse the air hardly effective. But it was all they knew. But it's not just the streets that are foul. The air itself feels heavy with smoke from constantly burning wood fires inside homes and workshops. There was no clean-burning stove or gas fireplace. Wood smoke hung thick like fog, irritating eyes and lungs alike. In fact, respiratory diseases were common, especially among the poor who had to endure smoky conditions without relief. You'd cough and wheeze constantly, wondering if the very air you breathe will be your undoing. On top of that, the noise of the medieval street scene assaults your ears. Imagine the braying of donkeys, the clatter of horse hooves, the shouts of vendors hawking their wares, and the occasional brawl breaking out. There were no noise ordinances or traffic lights, and animals often roamed freely alongside people. The cacophony is overwhelming to modern ears used to controlled sound levels. This sensory overload would make you long for your quiet, filtered environment. Your instincts, honed by decades or centuries of modern life, scream for cleanliness, safety, and calm. Instead, you get dirt, stench, smoke, and noise all at once, a perfect storm of discomfort that medieval townspeople accepted as normal. And while the wealthy might have had the luxury of somewhat cleaner surroundings, even castles and manors were not immune to these problems. Waste disposal was still primitive, and hygiene was a low priority compared to survival and defense. Bathing was infrequent, and servants or laborers often dealt with the grime. So, your first step outside medieval doors is a lesson in just how far sanitation and urban planning have come. You're hit by the stench of a world without modern plumbing, and your modern sensibilities recoil. Remember that feeling. It's the first domino in a long chain of shocks that would make you long for your 21st century bubble. You're thirsty, and so you head to the nearest well or river, expecting the clear, fresh water you're used to at home. But medieval water sources? They're a gamble of epic proportions. Unlike your tap, which probably runs through a network of carefully treated pipes, medieval wells were open to contamination from nearby cesspits, animal waste, and industrial runoff, if such a thing existed then. Drinking water was often murky, foul-smelling, and sometimes colored by natural minerals or pollution. Not exactly the kind of refreshment you were dreaming about after that stinky street walk. The importance of clean water in medieval times was only vaguely understood, at best. People didn't know about bacteria or parasites, and wells were often dug wherever convenient, without considering the risk of nearby latrines or slaughterhouses. It's no wonder that waterborne diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid were rampant. These illnesses could wipe out entire communities in weeks. With no cure in sight, you might think boiling water would be a solution, but fuel was precious, and not everyone had the time or resources to sterilize every sip. Plus, there was no real culture of hygiene that mandated such practices. In fact, some medieval folks believed drinking cold water could cause illness, a superstition rooted in observations of sickness, but misunderstood in cause. This unreliable water situation forced people to be creative or desperate. Some drank ale or beer instead. Fermentation killed many germs, but that came with its own problems. The alcohol content was low, but it was enough to disinfect the liquid somewhat and make it safer. The downside? Alcohol consumption wasn't exactly risk-free, especially for the poor, and dehydration was still a threat. Interestingly, some medieval towns had rudimentary plumbing, with wooden pipes or stone channels directing water from springs. But these were exceptions rather than the norm, often limited to castles or wealthy manors. Even there, contamination could sneak in through cracks or poor maintenance. Historians still argue whether medieval people suffered more from waterborne disease or from the close quarters and poor sanitation. But either way, water was a major vector for illness. You'd constantly be risking your life just by taking a drink. And if you dared to wash your hands or face with this water, your skin might break out in rashes or infections, making you more vulnerable to other diseases. The idea of clean water as a basic human right was centuries away. So, when you lift that grimy cup or dip your hand into the well, remember this is no gentle stream like your modern faucet. It's a roulette wheel loaded with invisible dangers. And your modern body would rebel against such toxins almost immediately. Welcome to medieval hydration, where even quenching your thirst was a perilous game. You're hungry now, and the thought of a meal might comfort you, but in medieval times, food was as much a risk as a relief. Your modern grocery stores, stocked with endless fresh produce and safe packaged goods, are a distant dream. Instead, food in medieval Europe was scarce, seasonal, and often questionable in quality. Imagine trying to find a reliable meal amid fluctuating harvests, poor preservation methods, and the ever-present threat of spoilage. Without refrigeration or airtight packaging, food rotted quickly. Salt was a common preservative, but it was expensive, and not always effective, especially for the poor. You'd be lucky to have anything beyond stale bread, tough grains, or dried legumes. Meat, when available, was a luxury mostly reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. For the average person, meat was infrequent and often scavenged leftovers or poorly butchered scraps. Spoiled meat wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly, harboring bacteria and parasites that could cause food poisoning or worse. The symptoms you'd experience would range from violent vomiting to prolonged illness, which, in an era without modern medicine, could be fatal. Medieval diets leaned heavily on grains and vegetables, but even these were vulnerable. Crop failures caused by bad weather, pests, or disease led to famines that could decimate populations. You might starve or suffer from malnutrition without ever eating a morsel of meat. Interestingly, medieval cooks often used spices like pepper, cinnamon, or cloves, not just for flavor, but also to mask the taste of food that was less than fresh. This practice may have helped somewhat, but it was hardly a fix for the deeper problem of food safety. Historians still argue whether medieval people were generally malnourished or adapted to their diets better than we imagine. But even the most optimistic view acknowledges frequent food shortages and poor nutritional variety. On top of all this, your modern palate would likely reject medieval food outright. The coarse bread, the thick potages, the oily, sometimes gritty stews all contrast sharply with the convenience foods and culinary variety you enjoy today. You might also encounter medieval food taboos shaped by religion or culture, meaning certain meats or dishes were off limits at various times, further restricting your options. For example, Lent imposed fasting rules that removed meat and dairy for weeks at a time, which could be brutal for those already struggling. And don't forget, hygiene food preparation areas were often dirty, and cross-contamination was common. It wouldn't be unusual for flies to buzz around uncovered meals, or for meat to be handled with unwashed hands, increasing the risk of illness. So, when you finally sit down to eat, your meal is a complex gamble between starvation and sickness. The struggle for reliable food supplies was a daily reality that your modern mind and body would find deeply unsettling. Remember, this isn't a gourmet feast, it's survival on a knife's edge, where every bite might be your last. As hunger gnaws at your belly, you might hope that medieval medicine could step in if you get sick from that questionable meal. Spoiler alert, it won't. The healers of medieval times were a mixed bag at best. You'd find a range of practitioners, from learned physicians who studied ancient texts, to local barber surgeons who doubled as barbers and performed everything from tooth extractions to amputations, and countless wise women using herbal remedies, some helpful, many not. Medical knowledge was heavily influenced by ancient theories like the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance of these fluids. The classic treatment? Bloodletting, where leeches or knives were used to draw out excess blood. You'd likely find this both painful and terrifying, and ironically, it often weakened patients more than it helped. Herbs were a big part of medieval medicine, and some, like willow bark, which contains a natural form of aspirin, had real benefits. but many remedies were based on superstition or misunderstood science. Think crushed toads, animal fats, or even prayers and charms. Historians still argue whether these herbal treatments genuinely helped, or if their efficacy was mostly placebo. You might be lucky enough to come across a healer who practiced some form of hygiene or had knowledge of wound care, but most people relied on folk remedies or church-sanctioned prayers. Hospitals existed, but they were rudimentary, often run by monks, and focused more on spiritual care than effective medical treatment. Surgery was brutal and rarely successful. Without anesthesia, sterilization, or antibiotics, even a simple cut risked infection or death. The idea of germ theory was centuries away. Wounds were cleaned with wine or vinegar, but rarely sterile by modern standards. Mental health was a mystery then, often interpreted as possession or moral failing. Treatments ranged from exorcisms to isolation. Hardly the compassionate care you'd expect today. So, if you fell ill or got injured, medieval medicine would likely leave you in pain, scared, and uncertain. Your modern expectations of quick diagnosis, effective medication, and hospital care would shatter against this grim reality. Remember that crooked, leech-filled remedy? You might find it all too real and all too terrifying. You wake before dawn, the cold biting through the thin fabric of your clothes. The sun isn't up yet, but the workday has already begun for medieval folk. And soon, so would yours if you had the stamina. Life here isn't measured by minutes or hours. It's a relentless grind from first light to last, with barely a pause to catch your breath. Your modern body, conditioned by comfort and convenience, is about to face exhaustion like never before. The average medieval peasant spent most of their waking hours bent over fields or workshops, performing back-breaking labor. There's no mechanized farming, no power tools, just muscle, sweat, and the occasional wooden plow pulled by oxen. Imagine lifting heavy sacks of grain, hauling water from distant wells, or tilling soil until your hands bleed. The work is unending because the seasons demand it, and your survival depends on it. One missed harvest could mean starvation. Your modern concept of a weekend or day off would be laughable here. Rest is a luxury reserved for rare occasions, usually dictated by religious festivals or severe illness. And even then, many still had chores to manage or animals to tend. You're not just working against time, but against the weather-fierce sun, bone-chilling cold, relentless rain, none of which offer reprieve. Medieval nutrition, which we covered earlier, exacerbates this hardship. Your body, deprived of essential vitamins and proteins, would struggle to repair muscles or recover energy. Fatigue would become your constant companion, sapping your motivation and resilience. Interestingly, despite the hardship, some medieval communities developed communal support systems like work parties, where neighbors helped each other during peak agricultural periods. Still, your individual endurance remains key, and without prior conditioning, you'd be outmatched within hours. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants were tougher physically due to their lifestyle or just perpetually worn down and vulnerable. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Add to this the mental toll of endless labor with little reward. The rigid social hierarchy and scarce resources offered little hope for advancement, breeding resignation and stress. Your modern mindset, wired for choice and comfort, would find this oppressive. You'd ache in muscles you never knew existed, your hands raw and cracked, your back screaming in protest. The medieval day demands more than work. It demands your very survival, and it shows no mercy. So, as the sun climbs higher, remember that your modern alarm clock and cushy office chair are a world away from this brutal reality. It's a life where every dawn signals another battle against exhaustion, hunger, and the unforgiving elements. You tug on your clothing, feeling the rough, scratchy fabric scrape against your skin like sandpaper. Forget the soft cotton or breathable synthetics of today. Medieval garments were woven from coarse wool or stiff linen, often dyed with substances that left your skin itching and irritated. Your modern wardrobe of comfort and style suddenly seems like a distant fantasy as you struggle to pull on layers that scratch, bind, and restrict. Washing clothes wasn't a daily ritual, either. Baths were rare, sometimes only once or twice a year, and clothes were cleaned sparingly, usually by beating them on rocks or soaking in rivers. Dirt and sweat embedded in fabric became the norm, and your sense of personal hygiene would revolt. The smell alone would make you long for your deodorant, but those didn't exist back then. People relied on perfumes or pungent herbs to mask odors, sometimes with mixed results. Bathing itself was controversial. While some medieval Europeans did bathe regularly, others feared that water could open pores to illness or was simply a waste of precious resources. Superstitions and religious beliefs often discouraged frequent washing, leading to a paradoxical situation where dirt was both accepted and shunned. Even the wealthy struggled with cleanliness. Royal courts had perfumed gloves and elaborate outfits, but they also had fleas and lice as constant companions. Poor folk had even fewer means to fight pests. Remember that story about a medieval king reportedly washing his feet in a mixture of wine and vinegar? Not exactly a spa day. Your modern shower, complete with warm water and soap, is a technological marvel. Medieval people made do with buckets, basins, or rivers, often in freezing temperatures. Clothes changed less frequently, meaning the grime built up not just on your skin but on your garments, too. Wearing heavy, uncomfortable clothes all day, often in layers to protect against the cold, made physical work even harder. The lack of proper footwear added to the misery. Wooden clogs or thin leather shoes offered little protection from mud, sharp stones, or cold. Historians still debate how much medieval hygiene practices varied by region or social class, but the consensus is clear. Compared to today, cleanliness was a constant challenge. Imagine the itching, the sweat, the smell, and the discomfort piling up day after day. Your modern comfort zone would feel like a distant memory, replaced by the relentless reality of survival through grime and grit. So as you brace yourself for another day, Remember, the rough fabric against your skin is more than just clothesits. A symbol of a life lived without the luxury of cleanliness you take for granted. Stepping back outside, you realize that safety's something you take for granted today, a scarce luxury in medieval life. The streets you walked through earlier weren't just filthy. They were rife with violence and lawlessness. The medieval justice system was brutal and swift, but it was far from reliable or fair, and often only the powerful escaped its harsher consequences. Crime was a constant threat. Bandits lurked on country roads, waiting to rob travelers, while cities had their share of thieves and cutthroats. There were no police forces as we know them, and the concept of public safety depended heavily on local lords, city guards, or even vigilantes. Your modern idea of dialing emergency services in a crisis simply didn't exist. If you were unlucky enough to be caught committing even minor offenses, punishments were harsh and public. Flogging, branding, or even execution could be carried out with little ceremony. Some towns had stocks or pillories in the main square where offenders were humiliated. Historians still argue how much these punishments deterred crime versus simply instilling fear. Moreover, the legal system was deeply unequal. Nobles often enjoyed privileges and immunities, while peasants bore the brunt of harsh laws. The concept of innocent until proven guilty was a distant dream, and trials often relied on superstition or testimony from biased witnesses. You might be accused on flimsy evidence, and your fate would hang precariously. Social unrest and rebellions punctuated medieval history. Famine, heavy taxation, or oppressive lords could spark uprisings. While you might want to avoid getting involved, merely being in the wrong place at the wrong time could lead to injury or death. Even daily life was physically dangerous. Streets were crowded with animals, carts, and people, and accidents were common. Without modern safety standards, you could easily be trampled by a horse, fall into a street pit, or be injured by falling debris. And don't forget about the constant threat of warfare. Borders shifted, and raids were frequent. Peasant levies might be forced into battle with minimal training, facing brutal combat that spared few. Your modern security systems locks, alarms, emergency responders are unimaginable luxuries in this context. Every step outside your home is a gamble on your safety. So, while the laws might sound harsh, in many ways, medieval life was lawless. The harsh punishments were often the only deterrent in a rough world where protection was scarce and justice uneven. Remember this when you next complain about a minor inconvenience. Your medieval counterpart would face much worse without even a moment's notice. You're born into this world, and right from the start, the odds are stacked against you. Childbirth in medieval times was a perilous ordeal for both mother and child. Your modern hospital, sterile rooms, and skilled medical staff are an unimaginable luxury here. Instead, birth often took place at home, surrounded by midwives armed with little more than hope and herbs. Complications were common, and many mothers never survived the ordeal. Infection, hemorrhage, and prolonged labor were often fatal, with no anesthesia or antibiotics to ease the pain or treat the dangers. The mortality rate for childbirth hovered high, and women faced this risk every time they bore a child. You might think modern childbirth is tough, but imagine facing it without modern pain relief or sanitation. For the newborn, survival was far from guaranteed. Infant mortality rates were staggeringly high. Some estimates suggest that up to half of all children born did not reach their 5th birthday. Causes ranged from poor nutrition and infectious diseases to harsh living conditions. The medieval mindset accepted this as a grim fact of life, though each loss was no less tragic. Childhood was brief and brutal. Many children took on adult responsibilities at a young age, helping with labor or apprenticeships. Education was a privilege reserved for the wealthy or religious orders, so most children grew up without basic literacy. Their world was one of hard work, limited play, and constant exposure to danger. You might be surprised to learn that, despite the harshness, medieval people valued children and mourning their loss deeply. But the constant presence of death shaped family life and expectations in ways modern society finds difficult to comprehend. Historians still argue about the emotional impact of these losses. Did people develop a hardened acceptance? Or were these tragedies just as heart-wrenching then as now? The answer is probably both. Your modern family life, with pediatric care and schooling, would be a stark contrast to this perilous existence. The medieval child's world was fragile and fraught with risk from day one. So, as you imagine your own first breath in a medieval home, remember this is a moment of hope shadowed by overwhelming danger. Survival was no guarantee, and the fight to live started long before you took your first steps. You grow up surrounded by the weight of religion and superstition, which permeates every aspect of medieval life and molds your very thoughts and actions. Your modern world, where science and reason often take center stage, seems a universe apart from this blend of faith, fear, and ritual that governs medieval minds. Religion isn't just a private belief. It's the framework for understanding everything from why the sun rises to why crops fail, why illness strikes, or why misfortune befalls a village. The church is a powerful institution, shaping law, education, and daily routines. Missing Mass or breaking fasting rules isn't just frowned upon. It could lead to social exclusion, or worse. Your modern idea of separating church and state? Non-existent. Fear of the supernatural is real and palpable. Demonic possession, curses, and witchcraft are common explanations for mental illness, misfortune, or unexplained events. People carry amulets, wear charms, or participate in rituals to ward off evil. Priests and exorcists hold significant sway, sometimes more than doctors. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were truly widespread or exaggerated by later accounts. But the impact on medieval psychology is undeniable. This religious landscape creates mental strain and stress. The constant vigilance against sin, the fear of damnation, and the pressure to conform are oppressive. Confession is not just a moral duty, but a terrifying scrutiny of your inner thoughts. Meanwhile, celebrations and festivals offer brief relief, but never erase the underlying anxiety. Your modern mind, accustomed to questioning and skepticism, would struggle with this worldview. The line between faith and fear blurs, and your understanding of the natural world is filtered through spiritual interpretations. Moreover, the Church's influence extends to education and censorship. Knowledge is limited and controlled, with books copied painstakingly by monks and access restricted. Curiosity beyond accepted doctrines can be dangerous. So, as you navigate this medieval mental maze, remember that your beliefs and doubts are shaped by a world where the divine and the mundane are inseparable, and every shadow might hide something more sinister than you expect. In medieval society, your place isn't just where you live, it's who you are. The social hierarchy is a rigid ladder, and climbing it is almost impossible. Unlike your modern world of relative mobility, medieval life traps you in a class determined largely by birth, leaving little room for change. Born into a peasant family? You'll likely spend your life farming the Lord's land, paying taxes and crops or labor, and living in modest huts. Nobles, on the other hand, enjoy privileges, land ownership, and influence, while clergy wields spiritual power and education. This division isn't just economics, it shapes your identity, rights, and even your future. Your freedom is severely limited. Most peasants were serfsteed to the land and beholden to their lord's will. Marrying without permission, moving away, or owning property was nearly impossible. Legal rights favored the upper classes, and justice often depended on status. You'd learn quickly that your voice carries less weight than your station. This hierarchy also dictates your daily interactions, clothing, diet, and even leisure. Sumptuary laws regulated who could wear certain fabrics or colors, reinforcing social boundaries visually. The gap between rich and poor is stark and visible. Historians still debate how strictly these roles were enforced across regions and periods, but the overall structure remained a defining feature. Some could rise through the church or military, but such cases were exceptions, not norms. Your modern expectations of equality and personal freedom clash hard with this medieval reality. The psychological toll of being confined to a social role with limited agency would be profound. So, as you move through this world, remember, you're not just fighting nature and disease, you're trapped within a social cage that shapes every aspect of your existence. You step back onto the street, but this time, you're hit by a sensory explosion that your modern brain can barely process. The medieval town is alive with chaos sounds, smells, and sights all colliding in a dizzying swirl. Your quiet, climate-controlled environment seems like a dream compared to this unruly scene. First, the noise. Imagine the constant cacophony of hooves clattering on cobblestones, carts rattling over uneven stones, vendors shouting their wares in a dozen languages, children screaming or playing rough games, dogs barking and howling, and animals braying or mooing. There's no traffic control, no noise ordinances, just a raw, unfiltered urban symphony that grates on your nerves. Your ears ache after a few minutes, longing for silence. Yet, this noise is part of daily life, an unavoidable soundtrack to survival and commerce. Medieval ears developed a tolerance you haven't. Then, The smells hit you a pungent assault that no modern air freshener can mask. The mingling sense of rotting garbage, animal waste, unwashed bodies, cooking fires, and manure make every breath a challenge. You try to hold your nose, but the smell seeps into your clothes and hair, following you relentlessly. The visual chaos is no less overwhelming. Streets jammed with people, livestock, carts piled high with goods, beggars, and children darting unpredictably. The buildings crowd together, wooden and stone facades leaning precariously, smoke curling from chimneys. Colors are muted by dirt and soot, but bright banners and painted signs fight for attention. Historians still argue about how medieval people perceived their environment. Was it normal to them, or did they find it as overwhelming as you do? Probably a bit of both. Your modern senses, honed by filtered air and orderly streets, rebel instantly. You might feel dizzy or disoriented, desperate for the sterile calm of a quiet room. This sensory overload isn't just uncomfortable, it's mentally exhausting. Navigating such a scene requires constant vigilance to avoid collisions, theft, or worse. Every step is an assault on your senses and nerves. So as you weave through this medieval maze, remember that surviving wasn't just about physical endurance. It demanded mental toughness to handle a world that never truly quieted or smelled clean. After enduring the relentless grind of daily survival, you might hope for a moment's escape, some entertainment or distraction to lift your spirits. But medieval leisure is a far cry from your modern Netflix binges or video games. Entertainment exists, yes, but it's rare, rough around the edges, and sometimes downright risky. Public festivals and religious holidays are the main occasions for fun. These events combine food, music, dance, and games, often drawing large crowds eager for respite from toil. Jousting tournaments and fairs provide spectacle, but attending them requires time and resources few peasants possess. For many, watching from the sidelines or hearing distant music is as good as it gets. Music and storytelling happen in taverns or around hearths. Minstrels sing ballads, and traveling performers enact tales, but the content is often moralistic or religious, reflecting societal norms more than pure entertainment. You might find yourself joining in, but the harshness of life tempers. The mood laughter is often brief and subdued. Games like dice, board games, or simple sports offer diversion, but also the risk of gambling losses or injury. Some pastimes, like bear baiting or cockfighting, are brutal by modern standards, but popular then. Attending such events means accepting violence as entertainment, a shock to your modern sensibilities. Interestingly, some scholars argue about how much free time medieval people actually had, and whether leisure was a luxury or necessity. The consensus leans toward leisure being scarce and highly influenced by social status. Your modern notion of relaxation, lounging on a couch, streaming endless content, would seem indulgent or alien in this context. Even celebrations are overshadowed by the omnipresent concerns of survival. So, while medieval people did seek moments of joy, their entertainment was entwined with hardship and often came at a cost. As you imagine yourself in this world, the idea of fun feels complicated and fleeting. Just when you think you're starting to adjust, a new wave of dangers crashes down on you. War, famine, and natural disasters. These crises didn't come with warning signs or safety nets. They were brutal, sudden, and often devastating. Medieval warfare wasn't the distant, mechanized conflict you might picture. It was close, personal, and messy. Armies marched through villages, pillaging crops and homes. If you lived near a contested border or a rebellious lord's lands, you could find yourself caught in the crossfire or forcibly conscripted into battle with minimal training. The trauma and destruction extended far beyond the battlefield. Famine was another harsh reality. Crop failures caused by drought, floods, or pests meant months, sometimes years of starvation. Food scarcity weakened communities, making them more vulnerable to disease. You'd watch neighbors grow thin and sick, and know your own survival was hanging by a thread. There were no food banks or aid programs. Charity was sparse and unreliable. Natural disasters like floods, harsh winters, or plagues added layers of unpredictability. The famous Black Death isn't the only plague. Smaller outbreaks regularly swept through populations, killing indiscriminately. Fear and superstition ran rampant, complicating responses to these crises. Historians still debate how much medieval societies were resilient or constantly on the brink of collapse due to these threats. What's clear is that these events shaped every aspect of life, leaving little room for complacency. Your modern disaster preparedness, emergency services, shelters, medical aid is unimaginable here. Crises could wipe out whole towns, and surviving was a matter of luck as much as skill. So, as you navigate medieval life, know that peace was fragile and disaster never far away. Your one-day survival could easily be cut short by forces beyond your control. You've endured the filth, the hunger, the exhaustion, and the fear. You've wrestled with coarse fabrics, chaotic streets, and rigid social orders. But the final blow is this. Your modern mind and body are simply not wired to cope with medieval realities. Your survival chances? Slim to none. Your body, accustomed to clean water, balanced nutrition, and medical care, will rebel at the toxins, pathogens, and physical demands. Your immune system, though robust, is unprepared for the barrage of bacteria and parasites endemic in medieval towns. Minor infections that you'd shrug off today could become fatal. Your skin, used to daily washing and gentle products, will suffer constant irritation and infestation by lice or fleas. Mentally, your expectations for comfort, hygiene, and safety set you up for despair. The noise, smells, and stress would overwhelm your senses. The religious strictures and social restrictions might feel suffocating, while the brutal justice system could instill paralyzing fear. Your sense of autonomy and freedom would be crushed under rigid class structures. Your modern reliance on technology and medicine means you lack the skills or knowledge to navigate this world's challenges. You wouldn't know which herbs might ease pain, how to tend a wound, or how to avoid contaminated food and water effectively. Your modern shortcuts, antibiotics, clean clothes, plumbing gear absent, replaced by trial, error, and often fatal consequences. Historians still argue whether anyone from outside the era could truly adapt, or whether the medieval environment shaped people's very biology and psychology. What's clear is that dropping a modern person unprepared into medieval life is a recipe for rapid decline. So, as you settle down tonight, grateful for your comforts and luxuries, remember, medieval life demanded toughness, resilience, and acceptance of hardship that we can barely imagine today. Your body and mind, as they are now, simply wouldn't last a day.